It's no secret that Australia is absolutely massive. The country spans the entire continent, covering a staggering 2.9 million square miles. That's plenty of room to stretch your legs. But when it comes to farming, not so much. You see, land degradation is one of the most serious and persistent challenges facing both the nation and the continent. Thanks to the combined effects of wind and water erosion, vegetation loss, and soil salinization, more than half of Australia's agricultural land requires treatment before it can yield anything worthwhile. To put things into perspective, degraded land makes up around 2/3 of Australia's total area. That's nearly triple the global average of 22% reported in 2022. If not for a somewhat unexpected hero, the situation might be even worse. Enter sheep. Yes, the woolly kind. Australians discovered an ingenious way to use sheep, specifically their wool, to breathe life back into barren soil. Let's explore how these animals have become surprising saviors of Australia's struggling landscape. First, take a look at this map. The darker the country, the more sheep it has as of 2025. As always, China tops the list. It currently has about 194 million sheep roaming its vast lands. India follows with around 75 million. And then there's Australia. Despite its severe land degradation, the country is home to more than 70 million sheep. Now, that's a lot of sheep. But are they raised to fight land degradation? Not exactly, at least not initially. The primary reason for such large herds is economic. Sheep are a major source of both meat and wool. In the 2024 to 2025 fiscal year, Australia exported approximately 657,000 tons of meat, an increase of 50% compared to a decade earlier. What gives Australia an edge is the efficiency of its sheep farms. They produce between 5 and 10 times more meat per hour of labor than most of their global competitors. That kind of productivity is essential, especially when labor costs in Australia are roughly 10 times higher than in countries like China. But sheep aren't just useful for meat. Their wool is another powerhouse commodity. Every so often, you'll hear incredible stories like that of a sheep wandering the wilds of Australia for years without ever being sheared. One such animal, dubbed a fashionista, carried an astonishing 44 pounds of wool on her body. And she wasn't even that old. Another sheep was found with an unbelievable 77 pounds of wool clinging to it, clearly a record breaker. On average, a domestic sheep lives around 13 years and can produce between 110 to 154 pounds of wool in its lifetime. With over 70 million sheep across the country, you can imagine how much wool Australia produces. In fact, the country is responsible for about 45% of the world's wool supply. That's nearly half of all the wool used globally, an astounding figure. But it's not just the quantity that makes Australian wool stand out, it's also the quality. Much of that reputation comes from one specific breed, the Australian Merino. These sheep, first brought from South Africa in the 1790s, have adapted remarkably well to the Australian climate. Over time, they've become renowned for producing the finest and softest wool on the planet. Merino wool is widely considered superior to any other fiber, whether natural or synthetic. While standard wool might be used for things like bedding and upholstery, Merino is all about premium fashion, high-performance sportswear, and even luxury undergarments. Thanks to this breed, Australia has become the wool capital of the world. But even this thriving industry isn't immune to economic pressure. The wool market peaked back in 2018 to 2019. Since then, prices have plummeted. At the lowest point, wool was selling for just 800 Australian dollars per 100 kilograms, about 220 pounds. Today, it's recovered somewhat, up to 1,200 Australian dollars, but that's still far below its former highs. Faced with dropping demand and high storage costs, many producers found themselves with a difficult choice: hold onto their wool and hope for a price rebound, or dump it and cut their losses. Some resorted to discarding the wool altogether. But others came up with a smarter solution: turn it into something that could help solve another of Australia's biggest problems, degraded soil. Enter wool pellets. These small, compact bits of wool are produced by feeding raw wool into machines that compress it into fertilizer-sized pieces. They're easy to use and ideal for Australia's drought-stricken lands. Unlike chemical fertilizers, wool pellets are all natural, and they're proving incredibly effective. Australia's need for sustainable solutions became especially clear after the devastating bushfires of 2019 to 2020. These fires were triggered by one of the most extreme droughts in recent history. In Sydney, rainfall was practically non-existent, just 0.08 inches over an extended period, and temperatures soared to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius. The fires made international headlines, but their aftermath was just as concerning. Vast stretches of forest dried out. Farmlands in states like New South Wales and Queensland turned to dust. And here's the troubling part. scientists say this won't be a one-off event. Extreme droughts will keep happening, and the land will continue to degrade unless sustainable countermeasures are implemented. That's where wool pellets come in. One of their standout features is water retention. These pellets can absorb up to 20 times their weight in water and release it gradually, depending on the soil's needs. This reduces irrigation demands and keeps plants hydrated longer. Though not a miracle cure, their effects are already visible. Some arid areas treated with wool pellets are beginning to show signs of greening again. But that's not all. Wool breaks down slowly over about 6 months, providing a gentle, continuous release of nutrients into the soil. Raw wool contains around 50% carbon, 14.6% nitrogen, 5% sulfur, and trace amounts of calcium, magnesium, and iron. Think of it as a slow-release fertilizer that enriches the soil without the harsh impact of synthetic alternatives. Wool pellets also help improve soil porosity, a critical factor in promoting healthy plant roots and overall plant growth. And surprisingly, they're also effective at pest control. Snails and slugs, which can devastate young plants, won't cross a border of wool pellets. The reason? The tiny natural fibers irritate their soft undersides, creating a safe, chemical-free barrier. Another innovative use of wool in agriculture is as mulch. Traditionally made from organic materials like bark or straw, mulch helps conserve moisture, suppress weeds, and regulate soil temperature. But wool mulch? It's next level. In fact, you could call it mulch on steroids. Let's talk plums. In 2024, Australia earned about $67 million from plum production. It's not the country's biggest export, but it's significant. Farmers looking to boost their yields began wrapping plum trees in a layer of wool padding mixed with cornstarch. The results were nothing short of remarkable. Fruit yields rose by 37%, the size and weight of the plums increased by nearly 49%, and the nutritional value improved across the board. The technique was later tested on strawberries, with equally impressive results. Wool mulch also stabilizes soil temperature, reducing daytime and nighttime fluctuations by 3.6 to 5.4 degrees Celsius during the hot summer months. Combined with its water retention capabilities, this makes it an ideal solution for Australia's scorching climate. And here's something you probably didn't expect: wool blankets. Yes, actual blankets made from 100% wool are now being composted in Australia. Since wool is biodegradable and the blankets are made from pure material, people began experimenting. They mixed old wool blankets with food waste and wrapped them in mesh to form compost bundles. Over the next 5 weeks, they added more food scraps and carbon-rich material, simulating a natural decomposition process. These experiments revealed something incredible. Wool compost significantly enriched the soil, just like the pellets and mulch. And since the country already had warehouses filled with unused wool, it was a practical and sustainable way to recycle a valuable resource. In the face of land degradation, drought, and market instability, Australians are showing remarkable ingenuity. By reimagining the role of sheep wool, from clothing material to agricultural tool, they've turned a looming environmental crisis into an opportunity for innovation. It's a compelling reminder that sometimes the solutions to our biggest problems are already hiding in plain sight, wrapped in fleece and grazing quietly on the horizon. This is Australia. You probably knew that already. But what you may not know is that until recently, Australia held a unique title. It was the last major honey-producing country in the world that remained free of the varroa mite, a tiny but devastating parasite and the greatest threat to honeybees globally. That is, until the summer of 2022. That's when everything changed. It began quietly. A single detection in New South Wales, near the port city of Newcastle. But in just a few short months, the situation spiraled. The government scrambled to contain the spread, and beekeepers were forced to make devastating sacrifices. Over 28,000 beehives were destroyed across 250 different apiaries as part of emergency eradication measures. To put that into perspective, the destruction zone covered more than 4 million acres, roughly 2% of the entire landmass of New South Wales. Each hive held anywhere between 10,000 and 30,000 bees. That's an average of about 560 million bees wiped out, not by the mite directly, but by humans trying to stop it. And here's the thing, many of those hives weren't even infected. They were part of pollination operations, sent into farms to help fertilize crops. But once the mite was detected in the area, all hives, infected or not, were destroyed without exception. It was a scorched earth tactic meant to halt the pest in its tracks. But it also meant economic devastation for hundreds of beekeepers, many of whom lost their livelihoods overnight. So what exactly is this bee killer, and why is it so feared? Let's take a closer look. The culprit is the Varroa destructor mite. Tiny, reddish-brown, and no larger than a sesame seed, it may not look like much. But for honeybees, it's a death sentence. Originally native to Asia, the mite was relatively harmless to its original host, the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. But everything changed when it made the leap to the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, the species used for most commercial honey production around the world. The European honeybee simply has no natural defenses against this parasite. While these mites are minuscule, they are proportionally among the largest parasitic mites on Earth. To understand just how invasive they are, imagine if a parasite the size of a dinner plate was feeding on you, crawling across your skin, biting, and consuming your organs. That's what bees are up against. And it gets worse. These mites don't just feed on adult bees, they specifically target bee brood, the developing larvae and pupae. They infiltrate the cells where the young bees grow, latch on, and feed on their fat bodies, a crucial tissue responsible for immunity, detoxification, and overall health. This feeding causes deformities, weakens the bees, and spreads a suite of deadly viruses. The most notorious of these is the deformed wing virus. As the name suggests, bees infected with it often emerge from their cells with twisted, crumpled wings, misshapen bodies, and a greatly reduced lifespan. These bees can't fly, can't forage, and can't defend the hive. They die young, if they survive at all. As the infestation grows, the hive becomes weaker. With fewer healthy bees to collect nectar and pollen, or care for the queen and young, the colony slowly collapses. Entire hives vanish in a matter of weeks. Left unchecked, Varroa destructor is capable of wiping out wild and domesticated bee populations alike. For Australia, the arrival of the Varroa mite wasn't just a blow to beekeeping. It was a direct threat to food security. Honeybees are responsible for pollinating 1/3 of the food we eat. Apples, almonds, cherries, cucumbers, blueberries, the list goes on. Without pollination, crops don't bear fruit. And without bees, pollination doesn't happen. In Australia alone, honeybee pollination contributes roughly $4.2 billion annually to agricultural output. The honey industry itself brings in around $147 million a year. But if bees disappear, that number isn't just reduced, it drops to zero. Entire supply chains, from farmers to grocers to exporters, would be affected. Food prices would skyrocket. And there's no plan B. Nothing pollinates crops as efficiently or effectively as bees. But stopping the mite is incredibly difficult. Once introduced, it spreads like wildfire. When it was first detected in New South Wales in June 2022, authorities established a 31-mile biosecurity zone around the infected area. Beekeepers were required to report the locations of their hives. Those within a 6-mile core were destroyed. The surrounding ring was monitored heavily for signs of infestation. Yet despite these efforts, the mite continued to spread. Human activity played a major role. Commercial beekeeping often involves moving hives across vast distances for seasonal pollination. One of the biggest events is the annual almond pollination, when over 300,000 hives are relocated to Victoria's almond farms between July and August. In 2022, companies like Duke & Bees moved thousands of hives from areas including Kempsey, a town that later turned out to be a hotspot for mite infection. By the time the threat was understood, it was too late. Many infected hives had already returned home or continued to other locations, carrying the mites with them. The result? Rapid spread across New South Wales, including outbreaks in Coffs Harbour and regions bordering Victoria. But mites don't fly. So how do they move? When an infected hive weakens or collapses, nearby bees often rob it for honey. And when they do, the mites seize the opportunity, hitching rides back to new colonies. Even modern beekeeping practices, like placing hives close together, create the perfect storm for infestation. Eventually, authorities had to face the facts. Eradication was no longer realistic. Despite spending over $100 million on the effort, containment failed. In 2023, the Australian government officially pivoted from eradication to management. Beekeepers were advised to adapt to the presence of the mite and prepare for long-term coexistence. For many, this was devastating news, especially when considering that all the previously destroyed hives, perhaps hundreds of millions of bees, may have died in vain. Still, it's not all doom and gloom. There's hope in science and in nature. Some honeybees have evolved resistance to the Varroa mite. These bees practice what scientists call Varroa-sensitive hygiene. They detect mites in the brood cells and remove the infected larvae before the mites can reproduce. Others groom each other and chew off the mite's legs. These traits are genetic and could be the key to survival. The challenge? Most commercial bee colonies don't have these behaviors. And even if they do, they're often less productive in terms of honey output. As a result, beekeepers have historically bred for yield over resilience. But that might have to change. Researchers are now developing artificial insemination techniques and selective breeding programs to encourage mite-resistant traits in bee populations. It's not an overnight solution, but it's a long-term path to coexistence. There's also a surprising twist to this story: native bees. Australia is home to more than 2,000 species of native bees. These insects are incredibly diverse. Some are stingless, others solitary, some tiny, some metallic in color. And they've existed on the continent for millions of years without any need for imported European honeybees. Now, with the spotlight on pollinators, native bees might finally get the recognition and protection they deserve. Ironically, the mite's invasion could offer native species a second chance. With the decline of honeybees, native bees may become more important to both agriculture and ecosystems. In time, they could fill some of the pollination roles left vacant by declining honeybee colonies. So where does this leave us? The arrival of the Varroa mite in Australia marks the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. Beekeepers, scientists, and farmers are all adapting to a changed landscape. The goal now is not elimination, but adaptation. To find a way forward that protects bees, secures food production, and preserves the fragile ecosystems that depend on pollination. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about bees. It's a story about us, and whether we can respond to threats not just with force, but with understanding, cooperation, and innovation.